Now we're going to bring you back here to the U.S., where the Trump administration has released new details on which companies actually received money, business loans, during the coronavirus pandemic. About 650,000 companies are on that list. Many of them include small businesses, but also various Trump donors, Democrat and GOP political groups, the Girl Scouts, even Kanye West's clothing line. Now, these companies included in the Treasury Department's list only include those that actually received more than $150,000 in loans. So we want to bring in Steven Portnoy, who's been following the very latest from Washington. So, Steven, you know, some of the more high-profile businesses are certainly getting a lot of attention, like Kanye West. But what more can you tell us about the list and who's on it?
Well, the list is an accounting of nearly 5 million loans given out by the Small Business Administration and the Treasury Department. The release yesterday of this information is rather granular, and it gets into the details of pretty much the size of the loan in various bands, up to $10 million. It looks at the average size of a loan, which is about $100,000, according to the Treasury Department. And the Treasury Department would stress that it has saved, or helped save, 51 million American jobs. The Treasury Department also says that the lion's share of, or a significant portion of the money has gone to low and moderate income communities, 27%, they say. So while it's true that a number of high-powered people and big firms, large chains, P.F. Chang's, for example, the large restaurant chain, a number of well-connected people here in Washington, lobbying firms, even though there's a restriction on lobbying firms getting some of the money if more than 50% of their income is derived from lobbying. Some of them have received some PPP money. The point the administration would make is that this is about saving jobs, and even some of those well-connected firms would argue that they too are employers and that their employees, Americans who work for small businesses, have been benefiting from this program.
So I want to ask you about something else looking forward to the fall. This is an issue that a lot of parents are grappling with, whether or not schools are going to reopen. President Trump is really pushing for schools to open in September. In Florida, the governor there said he expects schools to be open by next month. The president's going to be holding an event sort of addressing this. What can you tell us?
It's a roundtable this afternoon. The president will be hearing from parents and teachers and educators, students apparently as well. Yesterday, he put it in all caps. He said schools must open in the fall. And for the president and the White House, it's more than the idea that keeping students at home might have some negative impact on their sociological and educational well-being. There's also the idea that this has to do with the economy. And the president is very much of the mind, according to our sources, that the sooner you can get schools back open, it's really an emblem of the country reopening. The challenge, of course, is right there on the screen, the number of confirmed cases and reported deaths. And while the administration is expected to announce best practices on the part of the CDC for how to prevent the spread of coronavirus within schools, there are still questions. Namely, what about the teachers who might be themselves vulnerable or uniquely endangered if they were exposed to the virus? What can be done with them? The president has spoken of the idea that maybe older teachers should continue staying at home. The president, of course, doesn't control these matters. Local officials do, and the White House acknowledges that.
Yeah, there's still a lot of questions surrounding the opening of schools. One more topic I want to switch over to now. This Russian bounty story continues to occupy the president's mind in the interest of the administration. Just to remind people, it is a story that suggests that Russia tried to offer a bounty to Taliban-connected militias to kill Americans, right? These are these allegations. The president, there are a lot of questions about whether the president knew about this, whether or not the intelligence was accurate, whether or not intelligence communities had held differing opinions on the truthfulness of this story. And so now, though, it seems the administration is less concerned with those details and more concerned with who may have leaked the story to the media. What's going on there?
Well, there appears to be a leak investigation going on within the administration, at least according to reports. And according to reports, the list of possible leakers is narrowing. And that could be significant, because what we could see ultimately is a prosecution in this case if the administration is going to argue that national security damage, actual harm to the country, has been done by the leaking of this information to news organizations. Last week, and this was a primary focus of Washington news coverage last week, the White House continued to argue that the information provided to the New York Times was in some ways damaging to the country because it preempted, as they argued, the full analysis of this information. You remember hearing from the White House that there were dissenting views, and you alluded to it, Anne-Marie. The idea that there were some in the intelligence community who believed that it's true that the Russians have been offering bounties to Taliban fighters for Americans, and there are others in the intelligence community who believe it's not true. But the fact that this is now in the public domain, they argue, that is, the administration argues, means that that debate has come to an end, and that it's not going to necessarily be possible, at least according to the White House, for this question to be settled. The White House would consistently argue that the president has been tougher on Russia than any of his predecessors, and that he certainly would do everything it took to make sure that American forces in Afghanistan are safe. What's interesting is we learned last week from the National Security Advisor that once this information became known, even though it was raw intelligence and wasn't necessarily verified, in the words of the White House press secretary, it was nevertheless communicated to coalition troops in Afghanistan to ramp up force protection. Right. And yet, we were told that the president himself was never briefed, even though we've learned that it was included in his presidential daily brief, at least the written version. It was never spoken to him. The president says that he was never told about it, and he went on to describe it as essentially a hoax made to make him look bad.
We've heard that before. Steven Portnoy, thank you very much.